Rose Harsent is in the kitchen of Providence House on the last evening of May 1902, waiting for someone in the dark. Before morning comes, she will be dead, and no one will ever be convicted of killing her. This is a story from a small Suffolk village, where the lives of working people were governed by chapel and community and the slow machinery of respectability. A young servant woman, 6 months pregnant and entirely dependent on the goodwill of others, was found at the foot of her employer's stairs on Whit Sunday morning. The man accused of her murder was a chapel deacon, a foreman, a husband and father of 6, a pillar of the kind of village life that did not tolerate scandal. 2 trials followed. 2 juries could not agree. The case has been debated for more than a century, nearly always as a puzzle about the accused man's guilt. This episode tries to tell it differently. This is the story of the Peasenhall murder, told gently, with care for the historical record, and with particular care for Rose Harsent, whose name has too often been a footnote in her own case. Good evening, and welcome. There will be no sudden sounds here, no raised voices, nothing to startle you from rest. If you find comfort in these stories and wish to follow us, please do. Close your eyes whenever you wish. Let your breathing slow. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Her name was Rose Anne Harsent. She was 23 years old, and she had grown up in the Peasenhall area, which means she knew almost everyone in the village by sight, and most of them by name, and they knew her. That matters, I think. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't someone who had arrived from elsewhere and found herself stranded in unfamiliar country. She was local. She knew these lanes and this chapel, and the sound the river Yox makes as it moves through the low ground below the village. She had walked the main street of Peasenhall her whole life, and she knew, as local people always do, who was respected and who was merely tolerated, who kept secrets and who could not be trusted to keep them. At the time of her death, Rose was working as a domestic servant at Providence House, a modest cottage on the main street. The household belonged to William and Georgiana Crisp, an elderly couple, and Rose was the working center of it. She cooked for them and cleaned for them and kept the house in order, and in return she had a room and meals and the particular kind of security that comes from being needed. It wasn't independence, it wasn't freedom, but it was stability, and in the world Rose Harsent inhabited, stability was not nothing. Her room was accessible from the kitchen area. That's worth holding in your mind. A live-in servant's room, within the household but not quite of it. Present in the house but not family. There is a particular quality to that kind of life, a particular aloneness that coexists with constant proximity to other people. Rose would have had very little time that was genuinely her own, and very few spaces that were genuinely private. Her social world, the world beyond the walls of Providence House, was centered on the Congregational Chapel where she was a member. Chapel membership in a Suffolk village like Peasenhall in 1902 was not just a religious matter. It was a social one. The chapel was where you were known. It was where you belonged. It was where your conduct was noticed and your standing was maintained. Or, if things went wrong, where it could be stripped from you. For a young woman in Rose's position, with no independent income and no legal autonomy to speak of, her reputation in that community was one of the few things she actually had. She had been managing something difficult in the months before she died, something she could not speak about openly, and probably could not speak about at all to most of the people who knew her. She was, as the post-mortem examination would later establish, approximately 6 months pregnant. 6 months, which means she had known for some time and had been carrying that knowledge inside the daily routine of the Crisp household, attending chapel on Sundays, going about her work, and trying to find some way through. She had obtained medicine, some sources suggest, connected to her pregnancy, which tells us something important about Rose that I want you to hold on to. She was not simply waiting for something to happen to her. She was trying to manage it. She was trying to act. In a world that offered her almost no options, she was looking for the ones that existed. That's the kind of person she was, as far as we can tell. Someone who kept moving, even when moving was hard. And then came the evening of Saturday, the 31st of May. The night before Whit Sunday was a storm night. Rain came in from the east, the way Suffolk rain does, and thunder moved across the flat fields around the village. The sky would have been loud and dark, and the sounds of the storm would have settled over Peasenhall like a weight. The Crisps were upstairs. Rose was in the kitchen. She had a letter. Someone had written to her, arranging to come to Providence House that night, after the household was asleep. Through the back door, she had received it. She had read it. And she had made some kind of decision about it. Or perhaps the decision had been made for her, in the way that decisions often were for young women in her position. We don't know what she felt, waiting there. We don't know if she was afraid, or hopeful, or simply exhausted in the way of someone who has been holding something enormous for a very long time. The record does not give us her face, or her voice, or her interior life. What it gives us is the physical fact of her presence in that kitchen, and the fact that by morning she would be gone. William Crisp came downstairs on Sunday morning, the 1st of June, 1902, and Rose was not about her duties. He went to find her. What he found at the foot of the stairs in the kitchen of Providence House is something I'll come to gently in a little while. What I want you to know now is simply this. Rose Harsent did not get up that morning, and the world that had given her so little room to move in life would spend the next century arguing about what happened to her, almost always without asking very much about who she actually was. I'd like to try to ask that, starting from the beginning. Chapter 2. Peasenhall in 1902 was a village of several hundred people, living along a single main street in the particular way of Suffolk, timber-framed cottages, a few Victorian brick additions, the older fabric of a working rural community. The river Yaks ran through the low ground below the village, modest and quiet. The countryside around it was in cultivation, the hedgerows dense in late May, the fields under the long, growing season light. What made Peasenhall slightly unusual for a village of its size was the factory. Smith's agricultural engineering works had been operating there for generations, manufacturing seed drills and other farming machinery. During the working week, the factory gave the village a particular texture, a rhythm of metalworking and machinery that set it apart from the purely agricultural communities nearby. On Sundays, the silence where that sound had been was its own kind of presence. The social world of the village arranged itself in a clear order, as such worlds always did. At the top were the professional class, the Smith family, the rector, the doctor. Below them were the skilled tradesmen and foremen, people who worked with their hands but had risen to positions of some authority and standing. And below them, the domestic servants and agricultural laborers, the people whose labor kept everything running and who had the least say in how any of it was organized. Rose Harsent was near the bottom of that arrangement. Not at the very bottom, perhaps, because being in a settled household position was something, because being respectable counted for something, but near it. Her security depended on keeping her employment, keeping her reputation, keeping the goodwill of people who had more power than she did. And the center of that social world, for people like Rose, was the Congregational Chapel. Nonconformist chapel culture in rural Suffolk at the turn of the century was serious business. It wasn't simply a matter of attending services on Sunday morning. It was a framework of moral expectation that touched everything. How you spent your time, how you spoke, who you associated with, what you were seen to be. The chapel community watched itself in the way that close communities do, and it held its members to account. Deviation from chapel standards, real or rumored, was not a private matter. It became a community matter very quickly, which is how Rose had already found herself at the center of something difficult before the summer of 1902 even arrived. It had started the previous year, in 1901, with two young men named Wright and Skinner. They claimed to have heard compromising sounds coming from the doctor's chapel, a small outbuilding connected to the congregational chapel, when Rose Harsent and William Gardner were inside together. What exactly they said they heard, and how much weight it deserved, was debated at the time and has been debated since, but the claim was enough to set in motion a formal chapel inquiry. William Gardner was a significant figure in the chapel and in the village. He was in his mid-30s, a foreman at Smythe's Works, a deacon, a choirmaster. He was married to a woman called Georgiana, known to everyone as Georgie, and they had 6 children. He was, by any ordinary measure of the word, a respectable man. His position in the community was solid. His standing in the chapel was real. And that standing was what Rose Harsent had been brushing up against, through her chapel membership, through the choir. He was in her world as a figure of authority and standing, the kind of man that a young domestic servant was expected to regard with deference. He had been her choirmaster. He was part of the community that her own stability depended on. At the chapel inquiry of 1901, both Gardner and Rose denied any improper relationship. The inquiry found nothing proven. Gardner kept his chapel rolls. The matter was, officially, closed. But inquiries like that don't really close. Not in a village of several hundred people, where everyone knows everyone and has known them for years. The rumors didn't vanish just because the official process had reached no conclusion. They settled back into the life of the village and sat there, quietly, and Rose Harsent had to go on living inside them. Think about what that meant for her, practically. She was still attending the chapel where the inquiry had happened. She was still seeing the same people who had heard the rumors and sat in judgment on them. She was still dependent on her reputation for the stability of her position at Providence House. And she was already, by the spring of 1902, pregnant, carrying something that, if it became known, would cost her everything. I don't know what her daily life felt like in those months. The historical record doesn't give us that. What I know is that she was managing it, which took a particular kind of courage, or perhaps a particular kind of necessity. She went to work. She kept house for the crisps. She attended chapel. She obtained medicine. She kept moving. Georgie Gardner, meanwhile, was keeping her own household. 6 children, a husband who was prominent in the community, a life that was full in the way that working families' lives always were. She was a real person, not simply the loyal wife standing behind the accused man, though she would come to be described that way later. She had her own life, her own knowledge of her husband, her own stakes in what happened. And William Gardner had his own life too, the factory, the chapel, the family, the rhythms of a foreman's working week. The sound of machinery during the day, the quiet of Sunday, the particular weight of being a man of standing in a community small enough that your standing could be seen from every direction. This was Rose's world. These were the people she moved among. And threaded through it all, invisible to most of the people around her, was the enormous private fact of her pregnancy, and the question of what she was going to do about it. The letter that was found in her room after her death was not the first letter she had received. There had been other correspondence, introduced as evidence at trial, the details of which I'll come to later. But the letter found in the kitchen on the morning of the 1st of June, the one that had arranged a meeting on the night she died, that letter told her that someone was going to come to Providence House after the household was asleep through the back door. And she had known it was coming, and she had waited. The storm that came in on the evening of the 31st of May was the kind that moves across Suffolk from the east, bringing heavy rain and rolling thunder. The sounds of it would have filled the village, the drumming of rain on cottage roofs, the low rumble across the flat countryside, the wind in the hedgerows. It was the kind of storm that masks other sounds, the kind of night that makes what might otherwise have been audible to neighbors into something lost beneath weather. And in the kitchen of Providence House, Rose Harsent waited. I think she was afraid. But I also think she was trying to manage something that had run out of options. A 23-year-old woman, 6 months pregnant, with nowhere to go and no real power to change the circumstances she was in, trying to find a path through. That's who was waiting in that kitchen on the last night of May 1902. That's who we're here to remember. Chapter 3. Let me try to tell you what happened, as gently and as honestly as I can. And where I have to say I don't know, I'll say it plainly, because the gaps in this story are real, and they deserve to be acknowledged rather than papered over. The evening of Saturday, the 31st of May, passed quietly in the crisp household. Whit Sunday was the next morning, a significant occasion in the nonconformist calendar, and the village was preparing for it in the ordinary way, the chapel in order, the household routines already shaping themselves around the Sunday ahead. The Crisps would have gone to bed at a reasonable hour. Rose would have had the kitchen to herself. The arrangement in the letter was for someone to come to the back door of Providence House that night, after the household was asleep. Whoever wrote that letter knew the layout of the house. They knew the household's habits. They had some familiarity with Rose's situation, and they had reason to meet her in secret. And the storm arrived. It came in properly in the evening, and by night it was fully established. Heavy rain, thunder, wind. The sounds of the village would have been swallowed by it. Neighbors who might otherwise have been alert to sounds from nearby houses were hearing nothing but weather. What happened in the kitchen of Providence House between late Saturday night and early Sunday morning is something no living person witnessed, and no witness account in the historical record covers. There is a gap here, and it is a genuine one. I won't fill it with speculation or reconstruct it as if I know what I don't. The gap is the gap. It belongs to the night, and to the storm, and to Rose, and to whoever else was there. What I can tell you is what was found. William Crisp came downstairs on the morning of the 1st of June, 1902, expecting to find the household moving toward the morning, to find Rose about her work. She wasn't there. He went to find her. He found her at the foot of the stairs in the kitchen. She was dead. She had a wound to her throat, the kind of wound that a cutting instrument makes, and the cause of her death was that wound. A paraffin lamp lay broken nearby. Paraffin had spilled, and there were signs that someone had tried to set fire to the immediate area, though the fire had not properly caught. A medicine bottle was broken at the scene, and a letter, the letter arranging the meeting, was there in the kitchen. Rose was 23 years old. She was 6 months pregnant. She had been there since sometime in the night, in the kitchen of the house where she worked, at the foot of the stairs. The doctor was summoned. The police were called. The machinery of official response began to turn. The post-mortem examination established what Crisp had already seen. Rose had died from her throat wound. It established the pregnancy, approximately 6 months along. It established that the child she was carrying had not survived either. The medical facts were laid out plainly, as medical facts are, and they entered the official record as evidence. The Suffolk Constabulary took charge of the investigation. The letter found at the scene was collected. Handwriting comparisons were arranged. Witness statements were gathered from neighbors and from members of the chapel community. The investigation moved, as investigations do, toward a suspect. William Gardner was arrested. He denied everything. He had denied the prior relationship with Rose, denied writing any letter to her, denied having been at Providence House that night. His wife stood by him. His supporters in the village stood by him. And his detractors, those who had never quite believed the outcome of the chapel inquiry a year earlier, stood against him. The inquest was held, and it returned a verdict of willful murder. The name William Gardner was spoken in that formal context, in public, in the village where he had lived and worked and been respected. The weight of that moment, for him and for Georgie and for their 6 children, is not something I want to pass over too quickly. And then the case moved to Ipswich Assizes in November of 1902 for trial. I want to tell you about the trial as a human scene, because that's what it was. A courtroom full of people, all of them trying to work out what had happened to Rose Harsent in the dark, using nothing but the fragments of evidence that had been gathered in the days after her death. The judge, the barristers, the jury of 12 men who had been given the task of deciding, beyond reasonable doubt, what had occurred. The prosecution's case assembled the evidence piece by piece. The letter found at the scene, they argued, was in Gardner's handwriting. The prior relationship, the chapel inquiry, the rumors, all of it suggested a connection between Gardner and Rose that he had always denied. And the pregnancy provided what the prosecution called motive. A man of standing in his chapel and his community, facing the exposure of an affair and the paternity of an illegitimate child, had reason to want the situation resolved in the most final possible way. The defense pushed back on all of it. The letter was not in Gardner's hand, they argued, or at least could not be proven to be. The handwriting evidence was contested. Expert witnesses on both sides examined the letter and the samples of Gardner's writing and came to different conclusions in the way that handwriting experts in early 20th century courtrooms often did, because handwriting analysis in 1902 was not the reliable science it was sometimes presented as. The evidence placing Gardner at Providence House on the night in question was circumstantial throughout. No witness had seen him there. No physical evidence beyond the disputed letter tied him directly to the scene. The jury deliberated, and then they returned without a verdict. They could not agree. 12 men, having heard the full evidence, could not reach a unanimous conclusion about whether William Gardner had killed Rose Harsent. A hung jury. In practice, that meant Gardner was not acquitted. But it also meant he was not convicted. The case sat, unresolved, and the decision was made to try him again. The second trial opened in January of 1903 at the same Ipswich Assizes. The same evidence was presented. The same arguments were made. The same handwriting experts gave the same conflicting testimony, and the second jury also failed to agree. 2 trials, 2 hung juries. The prosecution considered its position and made a decision that has a Latin name in English law, nolle prosequi. It means, formally, that the prosecution will not proceed further. The case was not dismissed on the merits. It was simply set aside, the decision taken that pursuing a third trial against a man whom 2 juries had been unable to convict was not the right course. William Gardner was discharged. He walked out of Ipswich Assizes a free man in the strict legal sense of the word, not acquitted, not convicted, simply free. Rose Harsent was buried in the churchyard of St. Michael's Church in Peasenhall. Her body was put into the ground of the village where she had grown up, in the same season, more or less, in which she had died. The stone above her grave had her name on it, Rose Anne Harsent, 23 years old. And the case, officially, was over. Except, of course, that cases like this are never really over. The village had to go on living with what had happened. The people who had known Rose, who had sat next to Gardner in the chapel pew, who had given testimony at the inquest, had to go on living their lives in the same place where all of it had occurred. And the question that no jury had been able to answer, what had happened in the kitchen of Providence House on the night of the 31st of May, remained exactly where it had been, open and dark and unanswered. I want to hold that for a moment before I go any further. Rose Harsent died before anyone in that village was ready for it. And in the months that followed, the attention of the courts and the press and the public was directed almost entirely toward the question of whether William Gardner had killed her, which is, of course, a real and important question. But in the focusing on that question, the person at the center of it, Rose herself, became something closer to a piece of evidence than a human being. Her pregnancy became motive. Her letters became exhibits. Her life became a backdrop for a legal argument about a man's guilt or innocence. That's not the only way to tell this story. And I don't think it's the right one. Chapter 4. The Peasenhall murder, as it came to be known, became a story the national press found irresistible. A chapel deacon. A servant girl. A pregnancy outside marriage. A village in Suffolk. An unresolved verdict. These were the elements of a story that wrote itself in 1902 and 1903, in newspapers from London to Edinburgh. What that coverage did to Rose Harsent's name and reputation is worth considering. Newspaper reporting of the period was not gentle about women whose lives had involved sexual scandal. The fact of her pregnancy, presented as the motive for her murder, meant that the intimate details of her private situation were laid out in print for a national readership. Her name was attached to a story of moral transgression, and she had no voice in how that story was told, no way to speak for herself, no way to offer her own account of who she was and what had happened to her. She never had that voice. Not in life, not in death, and not in the century of debate that followed. I want to think about the theories. I want to do it honestly, the way a person does when they've sat with a case long enough to understand that genuine uncertainty is not the same as evasion. The case against William Gardner rested on several things that, taken together, had a certain logic. He was, the prosecution argued, in a prior relationship with Rose Harsent, a relationship both of them had denied but which the rumors and the chapel inquiry suggested was real. If he was the father of her child, which was never proven but was the clear implication of the prosecution's argument, then he had powerful reasons to fear what would happen when that pregnancy became undeniable. His standing in the chapel, his position at the works, his marriage, his family, all of it would have been at risk. The letter arranging a meeting was, they said, in his hand, and Rose opened the door. That argument is not nothing. There is a coherent line of reasoning there. I can follow it. But I can also follow the defense's argument, and I think intellectual honesty requires that I do. The letter was disputed. Two teams of handwriting experts looked at the same evidence and reached different conclusions. That's not a minor disagreement. In a case where the letter is the most direct piece of evidence connecting Gardner to the scene, a genuine disagreement about whether he wrote it is a significant problem. No witness placed him at Providence House that night. The storm had been loud and long, and had masked whatever sounds the night contained. The prosecution could construct a motive, but motive is not evidence of presence, and presence is not evidence of action. Two juries, hearing the full evidence under the formal conditions of a proper criminal trial, could not agree that William Gardner was guilty. That fact deserves to be respected. And yet no other suspect was ever seriously investigated. No alternative name was put forward with any force. If William Gardner didn't write that letter and didn't come to Providence House that night, someone else did, and whoever that person was has never been identified. The defense's position that another person might have been responsible is true as a logical matter, but it leaves us with a mystery that has no shape at all. An unknown person, unknown motive, unknown connection to Rose. I've sat with this for a while, and I want to be honest about where I've ended up. I don't know who killed Rose Harsent. I don't think anyone does, with real certainty. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The two hung juries aren't a failure of the legal system. They are, I think, an accurate reflection of the actual state of the evidence, sufficient to create serious suspicion, insufficient to satisfy the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. What I do know is that someone came to Providence House on the night of the 31st of May, 1902. Someone wrote that letter, or someone gave it to Rose to read, and someone was in that kitchen with her in the dark, while the storm moved over the village and the Crisps slept upstairs, and when morning came, Rose was gone. The handwriting evidence is, as a practical matter, unresolvable now. We don't have the forensic tools that the 1902 experts lacked. We have what they had, and what they had wasn't enough for certainty. The paternity of Rose's child was never established, and it never will be. The precise sequence of events during the night is entirely undocumented, and no amount of careful reading of the trial record will reconstruct it. William Gardner left Peasenhall after his release. He took Georgie and their 6 children and relocated, away from the village that would always associate his name with the question of whether he had killed a young woman in the night. He lived out his life elsewhere, never convicted of any crime, never formally cleared of it either. He maintained his innocence until he died. What that life was like, carrying that weight, in a different town where people might or might not have known his history, I can only imagine. Georgie stayed with him. Through both trials, through the attention and the press coverage and the long ordeal of living at the center of a national scandal, she stood by her husband. I don't know what she believed, privately, in the way that people who are married know things about each other that they never say aloud. I don't know what it cost her, but she testified in his defense, and she didn't leave, and that loyalty is a fact of the case that I want to name plainly and then leave alone, because it belongs to her and not to me. The village of Peasenhall continued. People went to work and to chapel and to market, and the factory went on making its machinery, and the river yaks went on moving through the low ground below the main street. The case became something the village carried quietly, as small communities carry the things that happen to them. Not always spoken about, not forgotten either. In the decades that followed, writers and historians and crime enthusiasts returned to the Peasenhall murder repeatedly. It appeared in collections of notable trials, in books on English criminal history, in essays on Edwardian murder cases. It was almost always framed as a puzzle. Was Gardner guilty? What does the evidence tell us? How should we weigh the letter? The question of Rose Harsent herself, of who she was and what her life had been and what she deserved, came up occasionally, around the edges of those discussions, but it was rarely the center. I think it should be the center. I think it always should have been. She was 23 years old. She was pregnant, and she was afraid, and she was trying to manage something that would have destroyed her position and her reputation if it became known. She was living in someone else's house, working for someone else's comfort, and she had almost no room to maneuver in any direction. She was not passive. She was trying. She obtained medicine. She received letters. She made decisions, or she had decisions made for her, and she opened the back door on a stormy night because there was something that needed to be resolved, and she was the one who had to resolve it, and she deserved better than what she got, both on the night she died and in the century that followed. Chapter 5. There is a churchyard attached to St. Michael's Church in Peasenhall. It lies quietly within the village, as Suffolk churchyards do, with the grass long between the older stones and the river yaks moving below in the low ground. It's an early summer morning in the churchyard, in the season when everything is in leaf and the light comes in low and slow from the east. It is the same season in which Rose Harsent died. Her grave is there. Her name is on it, Rose Anne Harsent, 23 years old. I want to sit with that for a moment, because in a case that became famous for the man who was never convicted, for the two hung juries, for the disputed letter and the contested handwriting evidence, it is easy to lose sight of the simplest and most important fact. A young woman died in a cottage kitchen in a Suffolk village in the early hours of a summer morning, and no one was ever held accountable for it, and she was buried in her own village, and her name is still on the stone. She had grown up in this place. She had walked the main street all her life. She had attended the chapel and kept her membership and tried to maintain the standing that her stability depended on. She had found herself in a situation that the world she lived in offered her almost no way to navigate safely. Pregnant, unmarried, in service, with no financial independence and no legal recourse and no one who could help her without it becoming known. The options available to a young woman in that position in 1902 were narrow and costly. She was trying to find one. I think about her a lot, actually. I think about what it means to be 23 and carrying something that you cannot tell anyone about, in a village where everyone knows you, in a household where you are always visible and never private. I think about the particular kind of endurance that requires. And I think about the fact that her story has mostly been told by people who were interested in the man who may or may not have killed her, rather than in her. That's not unusual in the history of criminal cases involving women who had very little power. Their stories get filtered through the legal proceedings that followed their deaths. And the legal proceedings were not designed to recover their humanity. They were designed to answer a question about someone else's guilt. Rose Harsent enters the historical record almost entirely through other people's accounts of her, through testimony about her, through evidence related to her, and almost never in her own voice. She left no diary. Her letters, the ones found in her room and introduced as evidence, were read by strangers in a courtroom and then filed away in the archives of the Suffolk legal system. She had, as far as the record tells us, no extended opportunity to speak for herself about any of it. What we have is her name, her age, the fact that she was local, that she was known, that she belonged to this place, the fact that she was trying to manage an impossible situation with whatever tools she had, the fact that she opened the door on a stormy night and didn't get up the next morning, and the fact that her grave is in the churchyard of St. Michael's, in the village where she was born and where she died, with the river yaks moving quietly below and the Suffolk light coming in from the east on an early summer morning that feels, in this season, not so very different from the one she last saw. The case of the Peasenhall murder was never solved. That is a fact, and I hold it plainly. No one was convicted. No one confessed. The person who came to Providence House on the night of the 31st of May, 1902, was never identified to the satisfaction of the law. Whatever happened in that kitchen is still in the dark. But Rose Harsent is not in the dark, not entirely. She has her name, and she has her grave, and she has this story, told with as much care as I know how to give it. I hope, wherever she is in the long quiet of history, that counts for something. I hope it's enough to say, we remember you, Rose. We know you were more than the evidence in someone else's trial. We know you were 23, and local, and trying, and that you deserved far better than what you got. The churchyard of St. Michael's is still there, in Peasenhall, in Suffolk, along the same main street where Rose Harsent walked her whole life. The grass grows between the stones. The ox runs on below. The light comes in from the east on early summer mornings, the same light it always was, patient and unhurried, the way Suffolk light tends to be. Thank you for sitting with this story tonight. I hope it has given you something quiet to rest beside. There is something I keep returning to, though, something I haven't quite finished saying about the case itself, about the way it was conducted and the way it was remembered. So let me stay with it a little longer, if you'll let me. The night is long enough. There's no rush to get anywhere. The thing about the Peasenhall murder, the thing that distinguished it from many other cases of its period and ensured that it would go on being discussed long after most of the people involved had died, was precisely the quality of its irresolution. It refused to close. The legal process ran its full course, twice, and both times it arrived at the same place. Not guilty, not innocent, simply undecided. That's an unusual outcome. Most trials, even difficult ones, reach a verdict eventually. The machinery of the law grinds forward and produces something, some conclusion that everyone is required to accept and move on from, even if they don't believe it. The Peasenhall murder produced no such thing, and that absence has had consequences for how the case has lived in the memory of the people who've cared about it. When the notable British trial series was compiled in the early 20th century, the Peasenhall case was included. The series was what it sounds like, a collection of transcripts and editorial commentary drawn from some of the most significant criminal trials in English legal history. Inclusion in it meant a kind of permanence, a guarantee that the case would be available to researchers and enthusiasts and interested readers for as long as the volumes survived. And the Peasenhall case has survived in that collection and has been consulted there and has been written about in the context of it by people with genuinely serious interests in the history of evidence and the development of forensic science and the conduct of Edwardian criminal trials. All of that is legitimate. The case raises real and interesting questions about the limits of handwriting analysis, about the standards of proof applied in courts at the beginning of the 20th century, about the way juries function when evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Those are worth exploring. I don't want to dismiss them. But the version of the Peasenhall case that lives in that literature is, almost without exception, a version centered on William Gardner. Did he do it? What does the evidence suggest? How should we assess the handwriting analysis? Was the prosecution right to bring the case twice? These are the questions that have been asked, and they are all questions about him. Rose Harsent appears in those discussions as the occasion for the questions, but rarely as the subject of them. She is the victim. She is the context. She is the body at the foot of the stairs. And I understand, in an intellectual sense, why that's the version of the story that has tended to be told. The unresolved question of Gardner's guilt is the mystery. It's the thing that gives the case its staying power as a subject for historians and crime writers. A guilty verdict, cleanly delivered, would have ended the discussion 120 years ago. But I think there's a cost to that framing. And I think the cost is Rose herself. When a case becomes famous for its irresolution, the person who died becomes instrumental in that irresolution. Rose's pregnancy becomes the motive. Her letter becomes the key evidence. Her decision to open the back door becomes the pivot point in an argument about whether Gardner was there to meet her. Everything about her is filtered through the question of what it tells us about him. And somewhere in that process, the actual person, the 23-year-old woman who had grown up in Peasenhall and attended the chapel and cooked for the crisps and was trying to find a way through an impossible situation, gets lost. She wasn't an occasion. She wasn't a context. She was the person this happened to. I've been thinking about what her life actually looked like in the months before she died. And I mean the daily texture of it, the small specific reality of being Rose Harsent in the spring of 1902. Waking in the morning in her room off the kitchen, lighting the range, getting the crisps their breakfast, cleaning the house, carrying the weight of her pregnancy, visible to her even if not yet visible to everyone around her, growing and undeniable and requiring some kind of resolution that she couldn't quite reach. Going to chapel on Sundays, sitting in the same space where the inquiry had happened the previous year, seeing the people who had heard the rumors, who had sat on the inquiry committee, who had decided that nothing was proven and moved on, but had not, in the way of small communities, really moved on. Maintaining the kind of careful, managed respectability that was her only protection. Writing, perhaps, or receiving letters. Making arrangements. Trying to be practical about something that the world she lived in had absolutely no framework for treating practically. And underneath all of it, the knowledge that this couldn't go on indefinitely, that the pregnancy would become visible, that the question of what happened next couldn't be deferred much longer, that something had to give. I don't know what she was hoping for on the evening of the 31st of May. I don't know whether she was hoping at all or whether hope had been replaced by something more pragmatic. The simple necessity of dealing with a situation that had arrived at a point where it had to be dealt with. But I found myself wanting to give her some hope, some small forward-looking part of her that was still, despite everything, oriented toward a future. She was 23. She was by all available evidence someone who kept moving even when moving was hard. I don't think she had given up. And I find myself wanting her to have known, in those last hours, that she wasn't entirely alone, even though the evidence suggests she was, in all the ways that mattered. The person who came to the back door that night wasn't there to help her. They came in the dark and left her at the foot of the stairs. The crisps were asleep upstairs. The village was sleeping. The storm was loud and indifferent. She was as alone as anyone can be. I hold that with grief. That's the only word for it. Not as a performance, but as a genuine response to the particular shape of Rose Harsent's last night. She was managing an impossible situation with almost no support, and at the end she was alone in the dark, and no one came in time. The question of why no one was ever held accountable is one that the two trials answered. In their way, the evidence wasn't sufficient to convict. The standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt is a serious standard, and it exists for serious reasons, and the jury system, however imperfect, is the mechanism we have for applying it. I'm not going to argue that the verdicts were wrong. I don't think I know enough to argue that. What I will say is that the outcome, whatever its legal justification, meant that Rose Harsent's death went without formal accounting. Someone killed her, and that someone went on living their life in Peasenhall or elsewhere, in the world that continued after her. That's a fact I can't make peace with entirely. I don't think I'm supposed to. There's another person I haven't said quite enough about, and I want to, before we go much further, Georgie Gardner. Georgiana, the woman who stood by her husband through both trials, who testified in his defense, who packed up the household after his release and left Peasenhall with him and the 6 children and started again somewhere else. She is, in many accounts of the case, a figure of pathos, the loyal wife, believing in her husband, bearing the weight of the suspicion that attached to their family. And that's real. It was a burden. The public attention, the press coverage, the knowledge that people all over the country were reading about your husband and the dead servant girl and the pregnancy and the letter, that's not a small thing to carry. But Georgie was also a person with her own knowledge and her own judgments and her own interior life, and we don't have access to any of it. She chose to stand by him. She chose to testify. She chose to leave with him. Whatever she knew or suspected or believed, she made those choices, and they were hers to make, and I'm not going to second-guess them from a distance of more than a century. What I will note is that her loyalty has sometimes been cited in accounts of the case as evidence in Gardner's favor, as if a wife who stays must know something the rest of us don't. But loyalty isn't evidence. It's a human choice made under human conditions, motivated by things that have nothing to do with the legal question of guilt or innocence. People stay with people they love even when they're afraid of what they might know. People stay because they have 6 children and nowhere else to go. People stay because leaving is its own kind of answer, and they're not ready to give it. I hold Georgie with the same care I hold Rose. They were both women in a situation not of their making, both trying to navigate it with the options they had, both without much real power over how the story was told or how it ended. That they were on different sides of the question of Gardner's guilt doesn't mean one of them deserves our understanding and the other doesn't. The village that contained all of them, Peasenhall, carried this for a long time. There are communities that seem to shed their difficult histories easily, that turn the page and move on without much apparent friction. Peasenhall doesn't seem to have been one of them. People who were children during the trials grew old in the same place with the same knowledge, and presumably passed some version of what they knew or half knew or believed to the people who came after them. The case became part of the village's identity, reluctantly or otherwise, in the way that things which happen in small places tend to become woven into the fabric of them. The factory went on. Smith's agricultural engineering works, which had given the village its particular character, continued operating for many years after 1902. Gardner's position there, his authority as a foreman, the daily sounds of the machinery, all of that continued after he left and was filled by other people in other ways. The physical place persisted long after the people who had given it its particular meaning in this story were gone. I find that interesting, actually, the way places outlast the events that happen in them. Providence House stood on the main street of Peasenhall after the crisps were gone, after Rose was buried, after the trials were finished, and the press had moved on to other things. The building didn't carry a visible mark. From the outside, it was just a cottage on a village street, the same as it had been before. The storm damage, if there was any, was repaired. The kitchen was cleaned. Life went on inside it for other people who cooked in the same space and had no particular reason to think about what had happened there on a May night in 1902. There's something uncomfortable about that. For me, not something wrong exactly, because that's just how places work. They don't hold the weight of the things that happen in them in any permanent or visible way. But I noticed the discomfort that the space where Rose died became, fairly quickly, just a kitchen again, and the main street she'd walked her whole life became just a street again, and the village went on being a village. She deserved to be remembered. She is remembered in her way, in her grave, in St. Michael's churchyard, in the records of the trial, in accounts like this one. But the memory is patchy, and it's mostly been a memory of the question her death raised, rather than a memory of her. I find that insufficient, and I've tried, in everything I've said tonight, to do something slightly different with it. I don't know that I've succeeded. I've told you the facts I have, and I've tried to arrange them in a way that keeps Rose at the center rather than at the edges. I've tried to give her age and her situation and her agency and her daily life the attention they deserve, and to hold the question of William Gardner's guilt at the proper distance, as a real question, genuinely uncertain, important, but not more important than the human being whose death gave rise to it. Whether that's the right way to tell this story, I can't say with certainty. It's the way I know how to tell it. What I'm more sure of is this. Rose Anne Harsent was a real person, not a case study. She was 23 years old, and local, and known, and trying, and she had been carrying an enormous private weight for months before the night she died, and she opened a door in a storm because she had reached the point where something had to change, and she deserved to have someone in her corner when it did. She didn't have that. And the world that let her down in life let her down again in the way it remembered her. I want this to be a small correction to that. Not a solution to the mystery. Not a verdict where the courts couldn't find one. Just a space in which Rose Harsent is the subject of her own story and is looked at carefully and is remembered with the full weight of who she was. That seems like the least we can do. The churchyard of St. Michael's Church in Peasenhall sits quietly in the village in the same early summer light that fell on it in 1902. The grass grows long between the older stones, the way it does in churchyards that aren't hurrying toward anything. The river Yaux moves through the low ground below, as it always has, patient and unhurried, the way water in low Suffolk ground tends to be. The main street of the village runs its familiar line, and somewhere along it Providence House stood, and Rose walked it on her way to chapel every Sunday, knowing everyone she passed, known by all of them, part of this place, in the way that people who grow up somewhere are always part of it. Her name is on a stone in that churchyard, Rose Anne Harsent. And the stone has been there for more than 120 years, through all the seasons that have turned over the village since she died, through all the debates and books and articles and arguments about what happened in the kitchen and who was there and what the letter meant. Through all of it, the stone has simply said her name, which is, in the end, the most honest thing anyone can say. She was here. She was 23. She was trying. She mattered. I hope she knew, in some part of herself, that the record doesn't reach, that she was more than what happened to her. Thank you for being here tonight, and for letting me sit with this story in your company. Rest well. A peaceful night to you.